Thanks for having me. I'm like very happy to talk about my work and ideas with everyone, and looking forward to the studio visits. And I guess if there's any time where my connection freezes again and I need to go back and repeat something, just feel free to jump in and let me know. Hopefully it's fine. Um, I think that kind of speaks to the nature of doing this on Zoom. And the kind of, obviously it allows for certain things for people to join who otherwise couldn't, but I think it also has limitations. And one of those is that it like I'm an artist who works in multiple ways, like sculptural, and I'm also deeply engaged with research and reading, and I also make a lot of moving image, and I think one of the things this doesn't allow for is me to kind of showcase a lot of that in this talk. So as I think I'll kind of break down the structure before jumping in, and I'm going to try to attempt to briefly and quickly offer an overview of the theoretical foundation that concerns what I call my practice, and here in the title page I'm referring to as one of parentheses and problematization. And it's not to suggest it as a totalizing overview. It's just it's a way to kind of prep the discussion of my work. And then I'll go into showing them some examples, and particularly with the time-based work, I will have to offer a reading and description of what's happening in those pieces and how I understand them as operating, and then move into some other works. And at the very end, I will showcase in its entirety the most recent film that I made last year, and that hopefully I'll talk for about 30 minutes. The film is about 10 minutes, and then that'll leave a good 20 for Q&A and discussion. So in beginning, I will say that my practice is broadly concerned with how power and agency are constituted both by and within the dominant sociocultural imagination, particularly its subversive flows and the many forms of embodiment and incorporeality that the dangers of representation reveal. My films, sculpture, and installations trace the symbolic and material conditions of social ordering in an attempt to destabilize its effectability, or in other words, the regulation of power. And in offering this kind of broad statement of how I understand my work functioning, I think it's kind of important to clarify what I mean by the imaginary. And I mean it in kind of multiple senses of connotations of the word, and from most importantly Lacan and the field of psychoanalysis, and he loosely defines it as the dimension of images, whether conscious or unconscious, perceived or imagined. And then for him, the imaginary is the basis of the imaginary order, and the formation of the ego and the mirror stage, which is connected to his kind of development and of a psychoanalytic theory, and which is connected to the symbolic and the real. And the details of that are not so much important, or there's not, don't have time to kind of get into that. Some variety, that also kind of inform the way I think about it, engage with it. Edward Lassagne, stating the imaginary is all the ways the culture has of perceiving and conceiving of the world, and every human culture has its own particular imaginary. And alternatively, Toni Morrison, when kind of addressing the literary imagination, the field in which she works, as a writer, she says, imagining is not merely looking or looking at, nor is it taking oneself and act with the other. It is, for the purposes of the work, becoming. So when I refer to the imaginary, I refer to the multiple understandings. And it's important to note that the imaginary is something with emotion, and that it has measurable terms and conditions, or a history that trace back to the very foundation of Western philosophy and its production of knowledge. What I mean by that is this capital I. And I think the most kind of evident example of that, or most obvious, would go all the way back to Descartes, which I assume majority of people are familiar with, and I think, therefore I am. Uh, so my work, my practice, is interested in the assumption of this I as the principal force of dichotomization in Western thought and the resulting mass of binaries that endure. It is easily evidenced that the I is the very foundation of production for the other, so what it is not, the prescriber of difference, or this subject slash object, male slash female, white slash black, human slash animal, etc. This cut or slash in all of the violence it enacts. To clarify what I mean, or what I'm trying to do is like briefly map a loose and admittedly bumpy trajectory of thought that is the epistemological foundation of Western thought, of how knowledge systems have come to be, to reveal that the I has kind of claimed a privileged position. It's assumed one, and it also has a claim of universality, and it's both the kind of maker of difference and the marker of difference, and simultaneously the unmarked itself. I think most importantly, what I'm getting at with this shift from this I to the slant, this cut to the slash, is that it allows for an acknowledgement of exactly who occupies that moment and this kind of fundamental constitution of the human, or the notion of the man, and even particularly who that leaves out. And so what I'm referring to here, is the kind of acknowledgement of the social hierarchy that is instituted like fundamentally in our systems of knowing. And it acknowledges a kind of social hierarchy that puts white masculinity, white patriarchy, white maleness at the top of instituting power and agency. And I have this Richard Dreyer quote right here, which I'm not going to read to you in its entirety, but he is someone who is kind of invested in the early 90s in trying to work against the institutional forces of whiteness, and to theorize whiteness in a way that offers it some legibility in contradiction to the understanding that whiteness exists as this I that obscures itself, makes itself invisible from being marked, from being known, from being visible. And so I'll just start in the middle. The dynamism of white instability, especially in its claims to universality, is also what entices those outside to seek to cross its borders, and those inside to aspire ever upwards within it. Thus it is that the paradoxes and instabilities of whiteness also constitute its flexibility and productivity, in short, its representational power. So I'll have a very cheesy animation here, but I truly want to get the point across of what I mean here, to like really visualize this shift I'm talking about. Because in this regard, this I is also mutable. It shifts. It's not as rigid as it kind of claims to be. Go. So this leads me to talk about a body of work that started in 2017 that kind of continued on until last year. That it consists of a series of short films and installations that I think of as scenes of both social fiction and semi nonfiction that attempt to turn the processes of ordering and control on/into itself as a type of reversal of the institutionalizing forces that are raciality and gendering. So the very kind of production of difference to kind of turn it back into itself. That is, while whiteness is a system that seeks to discover, master, regulate everything it is not, my project, this kind of body of work, attempts the seemingly impossible of deploying whiteness against itself as a means to discover what whiteness is not and question what it can become. I think question I have is, is it possible to refigure the very subject that is historically responsible for the notion of figuration itself? And in this piece, the short film, again, it does kind of acknowledge one more time that I'm not going to show clips of all of these works, and so that I can kind of show you something in its entirety in the end. Um, but this piece is about 7 minutes long, and it, I would say 80% of it consists of one kind of shot, one long track down a that features a kind of a 20-foot long prosthetic toe that is made from silicone. And while you're seeing this and the camera is tracking along, kind of the viewer hears this crying, this hysteric crying in the background, and it's not immediately known where it's coming from. And once you reach the end of the toe, you kind of cut to this close-up of this male figure who is revealed as kind of crying. It's perpetually going, and it cuts back to the end of the toe. This kind of ulterior hand comes into the frame, has a slight tickle touch. It relieves the crying for a moment. The hand pulls back out, and he starts crying again, and it kind of reveals this cycle, and the film kind of loops over and over again. And with this piece, I was thinking specifically within the kind of the larger economy of the imaginary that is like film or cinema, the gap in representation of this figure, and how infrequently there are representations of the hysteric white masculine figure, the unstable masculine figure, the unknowing, the unsure. And so this was a kind of a piece to kind of satirize that in the way that a lot of these works are. In the way that it's installed, it's projected on the wall in sort of kind of cinematic theater-like space, and there's carpet in red, kind of red, theater-esque carpet in there, and in lieu of benches or any other kind of seating, there's lazy boy chairs. And this is the kind of the first time, and I kind of carried this on through the work, that I kind of employed this move, but I was specifically interested in conjuring the notion of, or the space of, a home theater, and what that could potentially do for a viewer in that space of what this chair symbolizes, and what the kind of economy it is also connected to, back to this figure, arguably. And there's also a nice thing where, the viewer can kind of lean back and put their toe up in the air as well. And it ultimately poses a question of, who in this space and viewing this film and this content, like, who is able to see it or enjoy it as a kind of, or to approach it with humor, and who is it kind of a point of fear or a site of fear for. And so this is kind of important, crucial reorientation here. Here's another shot. In another piece in 2018 called Sweet Surrender, there's another prosthetic, silicone prosthetic, and I make these specifically for these films, employed with his character. And the film starts where he kind of comes out on this empty stage, and through a series of very campy cuts, and quickly he finds himself on a karaoke stage for Sarah McLachlan's song Sweet Surrender, which is like an iconic pop rock song from the 90s. And the podium that she kind of entered at is like transformed into the microphone, and also kind of transformed into this third leg. And I don't know how well you can see it with this image, but he doesn't have one leg. It's not a monopod. There's a tripod of things. And so this kind of relates back to the big toe piece and this exaggeration of the phallus, or the phallic notion within cinema, as representing the masculine, and this kind of extra leg to stand on, this excess he has, and it's very floppy in the piece. And it's something important to note that he never really, although he attempts to, he never really is able to perform this song. And it is installed like this, or it was installed like this. And I wanted to kind of mix different associations of spaces here. And so the presentation is like at once very funereal, but also kind of business-like with this monitor on this thing. And then there's these kind of classic theater seatings in front of it. And something that I should note too, the monitor was a kind of crucial decision in presenting this work, and because within the construction of the film itself, I was thinking about the language and grammar of reality competition TV. So, an example would be American Idol or like The Voice, and the way that the camera. I spent a lot of time on YouTube, like watching clips and trying to determine the ways in which the camera operates to frame subjects, and so there's a lot of kind of sweeping motion in this, and it's trying to be more kind of spectacular, I think, than it is, and it kind of really exists in a space of camp. Another film, Untitled with the descriptor Blue, it's made in 2019. With this work, I was interested in kind of economy of horror film specifically, and it starts by on the outside of this building that we see ourselves in now. So the camera is kind of outside, and it slowly enters and penetrates this building, which it's kind of figured on screen in consideration of the trope in horror films as like the monster's cave, of like entering this space that is seemingly dangerous, that maybe you're not supposed to, that you're excluded from in some way. And there's a song playing, it kind of in the film starts in the middle of this song that is otherwise looped, right? So the loop isn't dictated by the song, it's by the film. And then what is revealed is this figure dancing with himself, and he's kind of slowly turns around where there's this kind of this setup, and so there's this potential meeting of the figure of, you know, the monster figure with the viewer, the camera. And that tension is kind of set up to then be dismissed and relieved, because it's revealed that there's not an acknowledgement there. And the song at this point continues to loop again, and he continues to dance with himself as the camera punches in and in a way dances with him, and the arms kind of move around and turn around in the space. And they're similarly to the leg, like in the toe, very flaccid. They don't really have a lot of operation. And I think of them as attempting to visualize the kind of social constitution of this figure, you know, and of this eye. And this is also maybe a good point to acknowledge that in these films, there's always one character. There always is this kind of one capital figure, and that is kind of deployed against these otherwise relational spaces of the installation, where you as a viewer are kind of confronted with, you know, with them and to them. And I don't know if I finished my thought there, but that the arms are kind of stand-in to visualize the space that he is kind of socially constructed as taking up. And this is the way that this work was installed. It was built in this kind of room that was intended to look prefabbed, and so none of the sheetrock is really treated. It's just kind of put up to kind of mirror that garage space that the figure was in, that kind of man cave. And you enter through the door flap, and there's this blue carpet in there, and the video just kind of loops on the screen. And something that I left out that is important about this work is the way it's scripted. And not only was it interested in the kind of subcultural economy of horror, but specifically I was interested in this song called Blue. It was popularized by Leanne Rimes in the 90s, but it was originally written by this musician, Texas-based musician named John Mack, if I have that correctly. Might have that wrong. And it's a story, it's like a love ballad about this man who is kind of furious and also confused why someone he loves so much, this woman, doesn't love him back. And so I kind of take that song as a script, as a score for this, you know, form of satire that and parody that it's deployed against him. And Leanne Rimes' song is slowed down, and so that it kind of in a strange way like masculinizes her voice. kind of takes it back to the original source. Uh, the Final Man was made in 2019, and it is kind of getting closer to more of a kind of a narrative, in the sense that there's a start, an action, like a climax and an end. And that climax, that notion of climax, is important in this work, as you can see in this image here. It starts with a man entering a parking garage, getting out of his car, and hawking a really gross giant loogie across the field of, across the garage and across the frame. And there's kind of campy uh, effects that come with that loogie, and we spend some time there. And then the man kind of continues on throughout the space, and he immediately starts to something goes wrong. It's like there's this question of like, what exactly did he release? What exactly did he kind of spit out, and was it too much? And he finds himself in a bathroom, kind of in a state of unrest, and it's very quickly in the piece revealed that maybe he's starting to turn into the loogie, kind of transfigure into the loogie himself. And then he melts, as you saw, and it's similarly kind of as to the other works, very campy as well. But there's this melodrama of this figure melting, kind of turning into goo, his flesh kind of deteriorating or becoming his own flesh. And this work is installed like this. Again, this kind of carpet, domestic interior space associated with the home, or some kind of space of comfort. And I redeployed this chair here again. It's like a big reclining chair. It's not necessarily a lazy boy, but it also does recline, and it's leather, and it has a kind of skin-like texture to it. And it's important to note that everything in the room is very beige. And the title of this film, The Final Man, is also kind of invested in this subcultural economy of horror, but more specifically, it's appropriating a theory made known by Carol J. Glover, and she's a feminist scholar and film critic. And her theory is called The Final Girl, and it's a theory of the trope within horror films of this kind of singular final female at the end of these movies, where like all these people die, all these kind of horrible things happen, and then this final girl in her theory, and it very much indeed is a trope, somehow triumphs and finds themselves like as the sole survivor. And other theorists have engaged with this theory and shown, which I tend to agree with, that the final girl theory doesn't necessarily hold up, because there's always this reconstitution. Like Carol Glover like celebrates this figure, this girl figure, as like breaking through the loop of this kind of constitution I'm talking about, of this return to the normal, return to these dominating structures. But if you like kind of look closer at the films in particular in which she is analyzing, and I'm sure many people know this too, that there's always something that goes up. There's always this return to order, no matter what. Like either like she gets with the guy, or like the killer comes back, or there's always this suspense of like it kind of creeping back on you. And so I decided to take that title and deploy it here as The Final Man, as a way to kind of fantasize about, again, through this methodology of parody and satire, the ending, the melting, the consuming of this figure of himself into himself. This piece is called Showcase, or Hanes Men's Comfort Soft Tank. And it was originally shown in the exhibition that contained the Sweet Surrender film earlier. And in thinking about the way that I had deployed these prosthetics and special effects strategies to like extend or objectify the white male figure, I started to kind of question like how, the efficacy of potentially doing that further, of like removing them from that performing body, that performing subject. And so this is a common kind of white tank top undershirt that is cast and turned to silicone rubber, which I have a kind of long material interest and fascination, and maybe even arguably as an obsession with, that we can get into later if necessary. But I'm interested in it because of its inherent corporality, of the way that it is deployed throughout kind of multiple overlapping economies. Like, it's not just within kind of the structure of film to extend or augment the body, but it also has these other economies in terms of it's a silicone, not rubber necessarily, but silicone is also a lube used for like machines to penetrate other machine parts, and it's also a kind of a lube based in a kind of sexual bodily economy to penetrate holes that are maybe not big enough yet, to get inside. And so I think of it kind of in that similar way. And then here in this piece, I've tattooed Sweet Surrender on the front of the shirt, as you can see, and it was positioned in the gallery by the door, so I kind of thought of it as the like title card of the show in a lot of ways. And with this work, and maybe in kind of a transition from the filmic work, that project we're talking about, kind of shifting to the other recent work that I've been doing that is invested in this idea, similarly invested in this idea of marking the thing that which is supposedly cannot be marked, and the desire for that thing to mark itself. And so these are kind of raindrops or teardrops tattooed on silicone flesh too. I thought I had another slide, sorry. And there are hairs coming out if anyone's having difficulty figuring out what that is. This piece is called Sponge. And so with these two works, I'm thinking about the rhetoric within this, the field of the imaginary, and thinking about the dryness, the supposed dryness of whiteness, or its claims to that. And then here, it's kind of evidencing or trying to think about the ways in which whiteness, or I guess it's trying to equate the kind of white flesh to a sponge of taking in and absorbing something. And I started to slowly become very interested in the economy of tattooing itself, and started to look into the kind of the history, what we could call the history of tattooing, and formulated some troubling understandings or discoveries, whichever kind of language feels more appropriate. In that, if you look closely at tattooing as a practice, actually, I should say that if you right now were to go to Google and you were to like Google sample tattoo on a body, whatever language, like forearm tattoo, et cetera, guarantee you that like 90% of it would, if not more, would just be on white bodies. And so there's this assumption that that tattooing is predominantly a part of white culture. But if you look at this history, or the history of tattooing, it's troubling in that it doesn't originate from white flesh. That there was in the 18th and early 19th century this kind of erasure of tattooing from bodies that were not white, and this kind of what I'm trying to say here is like slowly over time the whiteness kind of consumed tattooing, and kind of shamed it off bodies of color, and eventually over time took it for itself. And can kind of think about subcultural implications of tattooing in a recent kind of history. And I can speak from a personal perspective in that growing up in Texas, in the States where we are, there was this association of tattooing being like alternative, right? Like I think that word's used a lot, and maybe it still is, but it not being normal. And I think that has slowly undone itself to where it's kind of become more accepted. But I'm not so much interested in that. I cite it because it's important, but I'm not so much interested in that because it ignores this larger history of erasure and consumption of tattooing. And so I've been making these works to try and speak towards this desire of appropriation and desire as kind of intertwined with appropriation rather, and to think about the signs and symbols that could reveal that. And so they're merged here. They're also peerished in a similar way. Oh, it just got mixed up. Sorry, there's the other slide of wetness. And this is one of the works included in the Blaffer exhibition now. It's a newer work, To Confuse Selfishness with Freedom. And similar to this work, or the other work, this one is also included in the Blaffer. And its title is Much More to Lose Than Shames. And the title of this piece was kind of taken from, directly taken from this quote in an essay called White Blind Spot. So it says, white workers have much more to lose than their chains. They have also to lose their white skin privileges, their prerequisites that separate them from the rest of the working class, that act as a material base for the split in the ranks of labor, in the ranks of labor. And in the context of this essay, it's addressing the working class in the 20th century in the US, and trying to understand and map out the ways in which what could be called like the poor white working class has, despite being abused from the state, still has these deep alliances to whiteness. In whiteness here, even despite the work and the forms of representational objectification that I'm employing, like it's important to kind of acknowledge that it is also, whiteness is a structure, right? It is a symbolic I, and it relates to a very specific subject position that it always isn't connected to that, like it is a systematic thing. And so he was trying to advocate for the working class to unionize. And I was interested in kind of taking this very literally, that quote very literally, much more to lose than chains, to make this piece and for it to appear as if this arm had been like flayed off of someone and put on this within this display that is very scientific or medical, and there are these kind of dissection pins that pin it down. And so to really kind of insist and pull the subject like into the field of the object, to objectify it as kind of directly as I can. And there's a snake, an alien, the mark of Cain. The text there, which is like common kind of tattoo text, says sacrifice. And so the images that I've kind of been combining together and putting into space can be considered like tropes in themselves, but they're also tropes of alterity, of difference. And so there's this way in which, if you kind of look at tattooing across multiple bodies, specifically white bodies, there's these kind of trends of this desire to mark oneself as difference, which is kind of contradiction, right, in everything that I'm saying. And this work is part of the series, right? And there's multiple pieces that are similar of the same title that are not here. Just kind of say that there's multiples of these. Called Impossible Erasures of the Impossible. And I kind of noticed a troubling trend online or it's troubling to me rather, of where people are like kind of tattooing the entirety of their bodies. And I say it's troubling because immediately there's this association of like there is like white flesh is rendering itself black. It's like inscribing color, right? And I'm interested in tattooing for that reason. Like it is the inscription in the flesh. It is the marker. It's a kind of imprinting of something underneath that that has potential within its logic and framework to disrupt this otherwise rigid binary. Um, but I was thinking about that kind of the idea to block out and its associations to kind of ideas within the field of what could be called like Black studies or Blackness itself. And I kind of turned to Fred Moten and a really great important essay he wrote in 2008, The Case of Blackness. And there's this moment in it where he is talking about this panel conversation that happened in the 60s between Cecil Taylor and Reinhardt, where Cecil Taylor really reads Reinhardt for filth, because Cecil Taylor is a Black musician, he's a jazz musician specifically, and also engaged with philosophy. And Reinhardt is a painter and artist, and also a sculptor. And Reinhardt kind of opens with an insistence on his reading, and this panel was about talking about Blackness and color. And Reinhardt steps out immediately and starts to kind of dominate the conversation, and insisting on his reading as reading Blackness as sight and through the field of vision, specifically a lack of the lack of Blackness, or merely within the play of absence and presence. And so this idea that Blackness is a negative of something is kind of really troubling. And when you kind of consider it in relation to the field of tattooing, and in reference to like a becoming and a desire to become, and again back to this question of what something is and what it is not. And within this idea of this kind of desire for appropriation, I really leaned into that with this film. And this is where kind of at the end where I'm going to stream this in its entirety. It's a film called This Weary Way of Walking. And the film looks at and kind of departs from the subcultural practice of mudding. And for those of you who don't know, mudding is something that takes place usually in rural places outside of city centers where there is mud, and people drive their ATVs, their trucks, their motorized vehicles through mud to kind of navigate it with the intention to not get stuck, but like very arguably the intention to get stuck in mud. And I was really interested in this subcultural practice in relation to the things that I'm thinking about within my work in general, because overwhelmingly mudding is it is a white male practice. And even in it's not that specific body, like, again, structurally, systematically, like relates, it kind of comes back to this thing of like kind of the desire to like inscribe and mark oneself, and the desire for like self-objection, I think is what I was thinking about, to play dirty, or like what it means to play dirty, to desire to get filthy, and in relation to, I think it's important to say, yeah, in relation to something that we're starting to see, and I think is a consequence of, this larger project of, being in a moment where whiteness, and when I say whiteness, I mean all of the kind of institutional forces, just kind of repeat this from earlier, it enables like, it also enables gendering, it also enables like sexualization, et cetera. But that whiteness is kind of, as it's being marked in this moment, it's long overdue, and kind of the recognition of all the violence. We see this kind of troubling shift into the appropriation of the rhetoric of marginalization, of the position of alterity, of the position of the kind of margin. And this piece isn't, before I show the film, I'll show these installation shots. It was built on this large screen and projected in kind of beige carpet again, and there are these kind of double double-seated folding chairs around the space. So I think I have to stop sharing and share again. Sorry.
Everything in what I'm about to say to you will lead back to the question of what it means to follow, to pursue, to persecute. What does it mean to come after, to be behind? As though already not yet. The ancestors of man first stirred up the moment they had to leave the forest, for whatever reason. Much has been said about this moment, and this so-called evolution of upright posture. From quadrupedal to bipedal, from 4 feet to 2 hands, from 4 hands to 2 feet, whichever way you want to look at it. Once in full bloom, our holes are now secluded deep within the flesh, only budding and squatting, shitting. I guess this is why other mammals still have their tails, for the sake of decency. Control is the precondition of taking responsibility, the ability to hold back or evacuate. The necessary moment of constitution. To forget oneself is the most ridiculous and distressing kind of social accident there is.
To wrap up, there's so many things to talk about with that film, and I couldn't really address all of them. I'm sure, just like I probably, kind of skipped over and had to rely on generalizations for the rest of the work. I think I'll just kind of let it be, and then maybe if there's questions about it, we can talk about it after. There's another installation shot of that work, kind of end here. That this piece is called In Notes. This way of walking, and it was kind of shown in a separate space simultaneously with that work. I think it's important to note that the larger project that is my work and the ideas it engages is not an attempt to rescue the subject. And I think, if I'm being honest, that's something that I've struggled with kind of wrapping my head around until very, very recently. And neither is it to reify the subject's conferred position of dominance. Although I think I have to acknowledge that any such project, such as this one, runs the risk of doing that. Rather, I understand and position my work as leaning into and analyzing the paradoxes and contradictions of whiteness's confrontation with itself. Through a process of what I call representational objectification, whiteness is marked, embodied, and forced to reckon with its own making. It is rendered inside out as object and poised to confront an outer reflection. Considering that the center in which whiteness has historically and socially occupied, arguably still does, at the very locale of the creation of difference, my work proposes this stronghold can be fractured, that the institution and regulating forces of difference can be unshackled from the prescriptions and dominance of the Western episteme. I understand this project of exposing or making visible whiteness to itself as voyeuristic, meaning kind of admittedly not well, I can define that later, I think. But as one that, so I don't, I see it as heuristic, but as one that hopefully aids in a larger project of dislodging whiteness from a centrality. In doing so, I propose that perhaps difference can become something much more potentially revealed, even those two are in turn and become marked by whiteness. Yeah. So I think I realized that I went over a little bit. I'm sorry. It's like it always happens, no matter how prepared you are. But I'm wondering if, and very happy to accept any questions or prompts to address something further. And I should also say, if it doesn't have to relate to the things I just said, it can, or even the kind of conceptual or theoretical framework, like it can be, you can ask me to kind of address those things, relationships to material, etc. Happy to show other things I'm working on too, whatever feels important.
I've got a question. Can I jump in?
Yeah, of course.
Awesome. Yeah, so thank you for sharing your work with us. One thing I'm thinking about based on what you just said at the end of the conversation, you ended the conversation talking about whiteness, but your work is so much about like white masculinity, and also with that last piece, like region is really important, and that feels like, I'm from Texas, I'm familiar with what you're talking about and what's going on. I don't know, and so I'm just left like really thinking about whiteness in broad terms, but also as it specifically intersects with masculinity and with Southern practices and Southern masculinity. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about those intersections.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. I think it's, it's a really, and like, I think you're right that there is a certain way in which it's also marked by something else. And that is a kind of like another contradiction in the series that is, a bunch of them. And just to kind of clarify, the reason that I kind of started out and wanted to frame the talk through this, like loose acknowledgement and foundation of the framework of the imaginary as it relates to this like capital I subject that is like, the transparent, universal subject that that is an institution of itself, that it is the institution of difference. Like, when you can't talk about, like, I would argue that you can't talk about gendering without acknowledging that it stems from whiteness. Like it kind of boils down, or boils up to rather, in this hierarchy of the central point. And there's a really interesting book that came out in the last few years by Kyla Scholler called The Biopolitics of Feeling. And the project in that book is kind of similar to what I'm saying here, and does a really good job at evidencing the ways in which gender and gendering forces are very much tied up into the kind of construction and constitution of whiteness, and specifically how that gender has been like kind of recuperated into whiteness itself and redeployed and weaponized to reinstill raciality, like to then kind of deployed against raciality. And what I mean by, an example of that she offers is like kind of the slow incremental progression of like, women's rights, and that it's still excluded, women of color and Black women in the US in particular. So that would be what I mean there. And, I don't know, did you feel like I answered the kind of like this idea of like the kind of southernness of that work in particular? I wouldn't say it's specific to Texas. It even exists in Canada, believe it or not. And it has now found its way, the practice of mudding has found its way to like other countries in Europe and beyond. And the internet is responsible for that, and YouTube, the economies that exist on YouTube of where all of this stuff is documented and shared.
Thank you.
Of course, thanks.
I had a question.
Yeah.
Okay, Ryan, you talk about whiteness and all your thought process. I mean, it's got the general theme. when you try to, your inspiration and how you get from one idea to the next, you've got the marking and the tattooing, which is, that was color, but then it's not. How do you make all those associations?
Um,
And
I think
mudding
what,
too.
sorry, oh, and mudding. Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
what I think it goes back to, again, the way I tried to set it up, and perhaps it just, didn't, I think everyone all the time could always be clear. It's like a constant practice, um, of this, again, it's this like this shift, this like really important, I think, for when I look back in my research interest in like reading other texts and having these ideas, the shift from that I that's inherent, to the side, that becomes the cut, that becomes the mark, the potential for inscription, and as it relates to the contradictions within the way, or like the rhetoric of the deployment and institution that is like whiteness. And so I think it really, if there's a thread in these ideas, it is that marking, that slash, that cut. And with the Big Toe film, that's kind of the first work I made in that series, which I hate the bracket things like that way because it feels violence, but that project is bracketed. It would be the first that, arguably in relation to a kind of maybe the field of psychoanalysis even further, like that toe is representing the phallus. It in the coming in and tickling kind of represents a cut in a way, like a symbolic cut of castration, like, because the way that the masculinity is upheld is its very particular specific terms of like rigid, definitely not soft, definitely not crying, tough, able to take on so much, but very defensive about, and purposefully not taking on certain things. And yeah, and so I think it, in some ways that's like that hand is is like the real ulterior other creeping in, and then that goes into tattooing, just to clarify more of like the, tattooing as literally marking the, the flesh, of like making a line in it, of cutting into it, of this. And I kind of kind of invested in like various theories of inscription. And I think if I had to synthesize that, it would be like ideas of the body as a site for reading and writing, the idea that this kind of malleability that, again, is in this shift, that like there's a potential to read and write all bodies, not just some, and versus others. And then the mudding, like the weird desire to like to dominate nature, to like mark it, to make a rut, to get stuck.
Then you're also addressing whiteness because of the vehicle, and it I mean, those are expensive vehicles, so only certain people can have those, and there's also another factor in there.
Yeah, that's interesting, the kind of relation to the class system. I think I would probably shift to the kind of flayed arm tattoo piece there, and thinking about like labor, and like the laboring flesh. But yeah, I don't know if I would. I hear you, and I'm not disagreeing. I don't know if I would quickly or comfortably say that ATV is a sign of a class position, because having shot that film and being immersed in that community, and it's something that my family does, and I don't have any problem, like similar to tattooing. I don't think it shouldn't exist, or that people shouldn't do it. I'm saying that it's a little bit more problematic if we look at it, and like, I kind of would say that this problem of parentheses and problematizing that I like titled this talk as, is like one of care and love, that like, critical analysis is like, can also have a bit of care, and because in the films themselves, like there is this emotionality, something that I didn't address earlier, that I can later, and kind of gotten away from your question now, but I just kind of thought I would follow it. But there's an empathy created in those films too. So.
Thank you.
I had two very different questions. I don't know if you would like
Sure.
me to ask one at a time, or just ask one and save the other for later.
I think whatever you want to do is good with me, and I'll try my best.
Sure. So the first one, you talked about like videos as being like campy and leaning into that, and in a lot of your works, you talked about like bringing in tropes. So I was curious, so far as like the tattoo pieces, like discussing the issues between like races when it comes to tattoos and like the origins of tattooing. I was interested in the fact that I didn't see any of the normal tropes I would expect in that kind of conversation, like, you know, the common sort of thing to get like Chinese letters when they don't even know what it means, or like tribal markings or different things like that. So I was interested in why you didn't go for the, I guess in my mind, more obvious tattoo tropes. Obvious.
Yeah, no, that's a really, really good question. And I should say that I have, and that like in this, there's so much left out of this talk, I think even in terms of my work of the last 3 years. And I just kind of wanted to spend a little bit more time with these things and hopefully be vulnerable in that. And because it's not often that, you know, I think we as artists get to do that. But I have done those things. Like there's a piece sitting over there that I don't think is resolved, that I haven't put out into the world, that has a, you know, a kind of Chinese lettering symbol that I had verified. It's a symbol that it means unknowing. You know, it means like unknowing and kind of like stupid idiot. And so there's a way that I've employed that I'm not so sure. And similarly, tribal, you know, like tribal kind of visual tropes have come into the pieces, but I may always make the decision to not release them, because I have to think about this thing that I said at the end constantly with this work, because I feel like I walk a fine line, you know, and one that needs to be walked. Absolutely, I think a responsibility as like a white male, cis male artist to do that, is like the reification of violence, you know, and at what cost. And it could be argued, if you step back, that the whole thing, if you take what I'm saying fully, that it is inherently a reification of the violence of like just to kind of tattoo something in of itself. But I think it also speaks to the decision as to why I choose so far not to depict flesh that is not white tattooed in the work, because I think that this you know, what I talk about with the violence of that cut and this marking and inscribing, and that larger institution of violence that it deploys against people of color and Black people, and like, you know, essentially not US citizens, because it comes back to imperialism and neoliberalism too, is that like those bodies have already endured historically and continue to so much violence that it's like really trying to look at that violence on the source, you know, at the source. And you know, some people might argue that that's impossible from a philosophical position, but I'm, you know, I'm testing that, and so I think that kind of, you know, I think that kind of relates to the certain tropes that are missing. And the question about camp can be pretty complicated, but I'll try my best, because this whole project and like where I am now, and these projects come from work that I made previously that was engaged with queer methodologies, and I was like really leaning into my own queerness and the kind of history of queer methodologies within kind of modernity and contemporary art, and it was invested in kind of power in a similar way. And at some point I realized that the work that I was making, that is, I would say, comfortably visibly queer, and I think an example of that is a piece at the Blaffer. For those of you who know, it's downstairs. For those of you who don't, it's downstairs at the museum, and it's this video of a male figure being vacuumed inside of a large latex bag, and so his form is kind of like constituted in this gray field that is the latex, like through this vacuum pressure being sucked. So this like male figure constituted, and he has an erection because he's sexually aroused, and then it's released. And so it kind of, there's like this breathing that happens with against this feeling or space of asphyxiation of not being able to breathe. But like that relates to a body of work, which there's multiple pieces that, again, I would say are very queer. And I started to have problems with that in the ways that it kind of allowed me to slip as an artist functioning in the world. The way it excused whiteness in some ways, and it kind of informed a decision to instead of like I started to use queer as like a verb. I started to queer things, and I think of these projects as inherently queering white masculinity, and I think that's why notions of camp come in, because there's ways that I probably appropriate those strategies to do that. Camp as like kind of a subversion of the norm in a way. And even with the leg piece, Sweet Surrender, and this kind of performing the Sarah McLachlan song, there's like very kind of, I think, draggy, like, it feels like he's camped up in a way with his makeup that it feels like he's almost doing drag of the character he's performing, that he's in drag. But I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, that did, and that's really interesting. That also leads well into the second very different question that I had. I'm really interested in your use of the word objectification of the white male, because objectification most often in conversations is usually objectification of the female body sexually. And so I would like to hear more about that. And I think I'm picking up from your work and from things that you're saying that there's a sense of like turning the things that historically white men have done to others, trying to turn that back on them. I think one of the things that I was thinking about specifically with that was in the to be wary of this way of walking, how he's shot and spews the blood. So that I think like I was really interested in that potentially being a symbolization of like perpetrating the violence back onto the normal perpetrators of violence. So I'm just interested in your more thoughts on objectification and on turning these actions back on the, like you said, the source.
Yeah, absolutely. If I had to synthesize like what I've been doing with both of these recent projects, it would be reversing and redeploying the processes of objectification and oppression that stem through the figure of the white male body, and that is the institution of whiteness, right? So it's like trying to like channel it back into it to hopefully destabilize its kind of affectability or regulation of power, to insist on that language again. And yeah, you're right that it is, I think, within kind of say Western US discourse, like objectification and is talked about through feminisms, and absolutely. But I also think that like it predates that too, and like slavery is the ultimate objectification, and that it turned people into property, into commerce, and that it, like, so that's another form of objectification that is not talked about enough, and was not talked about for a long time. And so yeah, I'm trying to trace your question here, and then into the figure being shot. Yeah, it felt important to kill him, but it's important to recognize that like it's a performance, like it is totally symbolic, because the film kind of is structured through this question, at the beginning of like everything, what I'm about to say to you will lead back to the question of what it means to follow, to come behind, to be after, and like I think it kind of leans into, again, like I think this methodology that I have is like it relies so much on satire and parody to kind of make a joke in a way. Is that what I want to say? I don't know if that's what I want to say. But he dies, but he doesn't really. He like washes it off at the end. you know, and it relates to that symbol of, you know, him getting shot through the chest from behind. Like if you notice, like it explodes from the front, so he's penetrated from behind. Like there's this literally fucking, you know, to be kind of obscene about it, like from behind, that penetrates that body. I mean, then it cuts to, you know, the flower, like that's a trope, you know, like splattered, and then it cuts to him cleaning off, and his face is no longer has this makeup on, which in one way, you know, it's read as like white face, which is fun, you know, like it's like a silly thing, like but more importantly, I wanted it to read and to signify his death, as the performance of death, and that's another trope, and especially within the last, you know, 2 decades of this in cinema and TV, of the zombie, you know, and the zombie is like kind of the living dead. And so within this idea, or my reading of the practice of mudding as a kind of like a self-objection, a self-social objection, it felt important to really make that evident, you know, to play that out. That he, you know, as much as this is a performance, and it slips through in these ways that are, I'm not saying they're knowing, you know, unknowing or subconscious, and it kind of, because it does, you know, these things operate for me in this imaginary space that is not always so directly performed, right? That's what I'm trying to say, that he can clean up at the end. You know.
Thank you very much.
I have a process-based question real quick.
Yeah.
And also a comment. I'm just gonna say it. I saw your work in your master thesis show in Austin, and after seeing it, I was just like, it totally changed my perspective on the way like I'm making art. And I just want to like let you know, like you've been like this huge influence for me to make moving images. So besides that, how were you introduced to silicone, and what is your favorite video editing programs to like animate that?
Yeah, introduction to silicone was through this decision to like start to interrogate the, like, you know, film, the economy, and in the way that it figures bodies and flesh and corporality. And so it was like silicone and also latex rubber are like used as the kind of material for prosthetics to transform someone into, whether it's a monster or like a different human, like, you know, and they're used because they are flesh. They're also most commonly, if they're good quality, like dildos, so sex toys too, you know. So there's this like because of their inherent corporality, you know, like body likeness, and even when you touch it, it's fleshy, but it looks like fleshy. It has the same weight. And I just became fascinated with it. I think I talked about this a little earlier, because I was looking at it through film, and it's like the way it's deployed in prosthetics, you know, to augment or extend the body. But then it was like, oh wow, there's so many other economies in which silicone relates. Like it, you know, and I kind of understood a potential through those overlapping economies, and that it's also theorized through scientists at NASA that like if we were ever to find another sentient species, that it's unlikely they would be carbon-based, it'd be silicone-based. So there's like a kind of association to alterity that's also fascinating, you know, that is like allows transformation into the monster, but it potentially could be that like real like alien, not human creature. Yeah, and then it just kept going with it, and it kind of made sense in coming in, you know, the trajectory into like the tattoo work. It just kind of carried into it, and for editing, I've used Adobe Premiere and After Effects. Yeah, and if you know, I recommend if you can to find a way to pirate it. But you're a student, so you can get it at that good discount. Thanks.
Ryan, hi. I just wanted to say thank you for your talk, and As being a fellow white male, I admire you broaching these subjects of whiteness, which is oftentimes an issue that is so hard to address from the white perspective, or to bring it out without somehow finding the entry point into the subject, or else finding a position by which to talk about it in that way, or in just simply defining it as for what it is. But I guess my question, in not just only in thanking you for bringing it up, but also in how you go about defining whiteness, and using a lot of the sort of stereotypical of images of whiteness, of the mudding and the tattooing and stuff. But I'm wondering how much of that can also be tied to class, and how defining whiteness through class can also kind of abdicate whiteness on other levels. That you know, it's not an issue that just is a certain segment of white maleness. It transcends that in so many other respects. So I'm just kind of curious on your choice of that, of using those images or those stereotypes in talking about the issue of whiteness.
Yeah, you know, I like to think that it probably has if there's like this insistence on, or like there's this common reading of the work of like being tied to a particular class of whiteness, and I think what you mean by that is like lower working or middle class. I assume, like, I would argue that it's probably like that reading is probably predicated on like one or two of them, and that like with the Sweet Surrender piece, like he's dressed up as a kind of business person, you know, and he finds himself in like the unknowingness and the kind of uncomfortability is like, I think should be read of like not comfortable being in that like campy space that is the karaoke stage, that is like the drag stage, you know. So you know, but I think it's important to maybe just reiterate again that like the way I talk about whiteness as like it's an institutional structural thing, that it is responsible for all of the oppressive structure. Like capitalism is a creation of whiteness, like that it comes back to this. There's regulation and dominance over everyone that is not, who cannot be read or signified as the white male. And there are ways in which that people whose ethnicity is not actually Caucasian are also still white, you know, like, and there's a way. And that's why that Richard Dreier quote is really important, because that like penetration into whiteness and like what it permits inside, and what it keeps its borders against, I think is important to acknowledge. And I think I also want to say, you know, the first thing you're talking about with the work, like it's like difficult, and I'm like, although I think I probably do make work fast, spend a lot of time thinking, and I am very slow in thinking, because I have to be careful not to like I don't want to make the work through what could be called like guilt. You know, it's not like like I if the project can be assigned to that and successfully argued and critiqued as such, you know, it would signify a huge failure of it, because I think that that's like not productive. Like it's a space to work beyond. Like I don't want to sit in that. And it's just reminded me too that what I have been referring to, the title, which is unofficial, but I'll say it, like I haven't fully committed to it, of the tattoo flesh objects, like that body work, I refer to them as whiteness studies. And that's a joke on the very constitution of whiteness studies, because in looking at whiteness critically and critiquing it and attempting to stabilize this, it's not to create something or allow for a space of white pride. Like that's absurd. It's to abolish whiteness, to aid in that larger process. And here's where, you know, an interesting paradox is presented, and that it's perpetually going back, that I keep perpetually going back to, and lots of people have talked about this, and you know, and critical race theorists and critical theorists in general, of like the challenge of moving through that, because like whiteness makes itself invisible, you know, to itself. It's designed that way, you know, to not be seen. So I kind of position my practice of trying to make it visible, so that we can, you know, so that when everyone can finally see it for what it is, and it's it's a given, you know, it's a fact, that we can start to kind of move beyond it, and embrace that potentiality of difference that, I would probably defer here to someone like Edward Glissant in Poetics of Relation, who talks about a very exciting and thrilling, it's not perfect, but maybe almost structure for relating to one another. But,
Thank you.
Maybe one more question.
I have a question. I'm just not sure exactly how to phrase it, so I'm sorry if it seems confusing. But I'm wondering how your thought processes around and through sort of the complication of your being implicated as part of the group you're critiquing, but then also sort of othering yourself as saying like you're kind of, in a way, by critiquing it, you're saying you're sort of like outside of the problem in to some degree, or you can view it in a way as problematic, so there's like a difference in how talking about these like masculine or racial stereotypes while inhabiting them, I guess, is like a complicated position you've touched on, and I'm just wondering how you some strategies maybe that you employ to navigate that, and like where the boundaries are between like your own implications in the work and who you're objectifying.
yeah, that's a really good question. Thank you. That kind of crucial one, and it's something that I have thought about multiple times, and it, it it was something also that I kind of hoped was the obvious, like, and so and or like that would be suspended as like that unspoken, and like starting out with this like capital I, and then having to proceed through the talk saying I, like it's but that like that I am that figure too, and I'm implicated in it is yeah. I mean, it's a complicated one, and I tend to want to talk about something that I have not fully fleshed out yet, but it's kind of been helpful for me to think about this very notion of like that fracture that happens when whiteness is confronted with itself, and the kind of hindrance that it's designed to do. And there are predecessors. We have predecessors who who are white, speaking to whiteness, who are kind of reflecting it back. Maurice Berger would be a really great one, who unfortunately who's an amazing scholar and kind of idol of mine, who unfortunately passed away last year due to COVID. He wrote this amazing book called White Lies. So I'd recommend that if this is an interest. But also to like Black and brown academics and scholars and artists who have been saying these things for a really long time. And I think in that, the inability to hear that, or decision not to hear it, whichever, you want to say it, I'm being like overly generous here, maybe a way that's problematic, but is something that I think it's part of this process, of doing it. And the theory that I was talking about earlier that I haven't fully fleshed out is like I'm starting to theorize. It's directly coming from this notion prescribed by Du Bois, and who was a scholar and philosopher writing in the and abolitionist, I should say, writing in the early 20th century. He kind of coined this idea of like the Blackness and Black people having a double consciousness, and specifically because of like their Blackness that can't be seen, that's relegated outside of whiteness, but also in the objectification that whiteness had prescribed to them. I thought it was really interesting as a potential inspiration and like appropriation in a way that's like academic and careful, and a lineage, not an point of arguing contention, but a continuation of that to try to develop what I've been calling like white schizophrenia. That is this fracture that whiteness confronting itself. And now I'm actually remembering something that there was this magazine that existed in the 1990s in the US, called Race Trader. And it was a group of self-described white abolitionists. So leftists and academics who were invested and created this publication to aid in the abolition of whiteness. And I think they would even say like abolition of raciality itself, the categorization of raciality, which has problems now. But they say something in their kind of intro letter that I think is quite important, and something it's worth holding on to, is that despite their criticism and the level and engagement of this criticism, that they don't believe, and I think I would share this, that people who are identified as white, exist as white, have that privilege, aren't deeply invested. The majority of these people aren't deeply invested in upholding white supremacy in the ways that I think maybe kind of reductionist liberal identity politic would allow or say it would. It's not, and that's to say that there's not an active daily decision, like that type of racism. It's not being excused, that hates someone for the color of their skin is not as grandiose. It's structural, it's systematic, right? And that it comes down to confrontation so it's a different issue that's very serious. It's complicity is another issue. And that's where they kind of step in, and that's where they see a critique of, and this group in the kind of Race Trader magazine, Noel Irgatoff, who I quoted earlier in White Blind Spot, was kind of a founder of this. I forgot what I was saying there, but they're invested in this critique of disrupting and eliminating that discomfort to encourage more people to be a traitor to whiteness. I hope that answered it. And I'm inspired by that directly.
Thanks.
Thank you, Ryan. All right.
Cool. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for taking the time to answer your questions so thoughtfully, and thank you for a really great talk and presentation of your work.